Welcome to my YouTube channel. This is your entrepreneurship tutor, Professor Henry Buisa. Colleagues, recently I talked about qualitative research and overview. I'm happy that I made some impact because the feedback that I got was very encouraging, and some of you colleagues plus students asked me to talk about impact, effect, and influence studies. And today I want to have just an overview of these methods or these types of research. Now, let's have a look at some impact, influence, effect in our everyday life. Look at that. Drought. The impact of drought on our crops. Yes, we feel that impact every now and then in our lives. Look at influence. We're looking at peer pressure, peer influence to our children in schools, in colleges, and all that. We also have effect, like effect of smoking on our lungs. So we feel these words, we feel these terms in our everyday life. Impact, impact of drought on our agriculture, influence of peer pressure on our kids. Yes, effect of smoking on our lungs. So these are terms that we are quite familiar with. Now, let's define impact, effect, and influence. Now, the Oxford English Dictionary gives a definition of the word impact as a marked effect or influence. Look at that. Impact being defined via effect and influence. And at that site, it says that the main difference between impact and effect is that impact is the influence of an action or a phenomenon on something or someone, whereas effect is the consequences, outcome of action or phenomenon. Colleagues, you will agree with me that clearly there is some very blurred difference between these three terms. They can be used synonymously if you like. But look at it, read between the lines. There is a thinly veiled commonality among them as far as research is concerned. And this seems to be intervention and change. Drought intervenes and our crops change. Peer pressure intervenes and the behavior of our kids change. Smoking intervenes and our lungs change. So, two words that are very important in impact, influence, and effect study. There must be an intervention that causes those results or that brings out that change. And that is what we need, or we should be measuring in our studies of impact, influence, and effect. Now, therefore, these studies, impact, effect, and influence, do assess how outcomes have been affected by an intervention, whether the outcomes were intended or not intended. Yes, an intervention can come in, a policy can come in with good intentions, but it can bring bad intentions or unplanned intentions. All those are what we look at when we are talking about impact. Is it a negative impact? Was it a positive impact? Was it both? Now, the proper analysis of such studies requires a counterfactual of what those outcomes would have been in the absence of an intervention. In other words, when we're talking of an impact of an intervention, we are also at the back of our mind asking, what would have happened if this intervention was not there? That will be the true impact study. What would have happened if I didn't take my kids to school to get this peer pressure? You know, what would have happened if I didn't smoke? That's the counterfactual. And without the counterfactual, it will be tricky to actually do an impact. Look, we have examples. Let me give you some examples of intervention. Intervention is something that comes between two things, or something that changes the course of something. Let's put them in sentences. Look, he was realizing the impact the lie had on their relationship. You see now, a lie is the intervention. The lie came in and affected or changed their relationship. That's what we're saying. So there's an intervention that brings a change. We can say he used his influence to reform the company's policies. Look, he is the intervention, affected or changed the policies. Look, exercise had positive effects on her figure. Exercise is an intervention, and the figure changed. So you see, if we put them in sentences, we shall clearly see that impact, effect, influence uses interventions. We are studying an intervention that caused the change. I hope we're starting to see that without the intervention, it will be probably inconclusive to start impact, influence, or effect. And in all those, we're looking at change. And what's change? Movement from one state to another state. That must be captured. That must be captured. And therefore, as an overview, I want to run over some key terms in these studies that might guide you as you go with your, you go on with your research. There's what we call counterfactual. Counterfactual is simply what would have happened without the intervention. What would have happened if there was no drought? So, how can we capture that? The drought came, of course, and it affected the maize, for example. But what would have happened if there was no drought? We need to capture that situation. Look, it therefore implies that to effectively start an impact of an intervention or to a group, we need another similar, but one to which the intervention was not applied. In the case of like our maize, drought came in Kitale. It affected the maize. Look, there was no drought in Kisumu. Look, the maize were not affected. I'm just using that as an example. Look, implied is the fact that impact studies involve counterfactual analysis. Without counterfactual analysis, your impact study will be incomplete. That is a comparison between what actually happened and what would have happened in the absence of the intervention. So, counterfactual analysis is also called with versus without. So if we are going to do our impact studies, that concept of with versus without is very crucial. Without it, the study will be incomplete. For example, the effect of green supply chain adoption on the performance of agri-manufacturing farms in Rwanda. Yes, this was a recently undertaken research in cohort. To effectively measure the said effects taken by me to be impact, it would have been necessary to use counterfactual or those who did not adopt the green supply chain. Without capturing those who did not, the results could be debated. I looked at this work and I saw we could improve it, of course, or we could have improved it, but we can improve the future. Now, there is a before and after in matters impact, in matters influence. Before my girl went to school, she was good, but after she went to school, something happened. She was influenced. Before I was smoking, my lungs were okay, but after I smoked, my lungs changed. You know? So, in the statement, he was realizing the impact the lie had on their relationship. We clearly see that the relationship before the lie came in must have been different. So, if we don't capture before and after, again, it will be tricky measuring the actual impact. An impact, influence, and effect implies change caused by the intervention. And therefore, we have the before and after situation. This is very crucial in impact studies, in effect studies, and even in influence studies. impact of M-Pesa on growth of micro and small business enterprise in River Road, Nairobi, Kenya. Yes, this study was also recently undertaken in Cohort. It implied here, therefore, is that the study measured the change in growth of MSC brought about by the coming of M-Pesa. So we're saying M-Pesa has come and has brought the change. Therefore, we measure the impact of M-Pesa. So we must look at that group that we're studying that was maybe using M-Pesa, maybe for transactions, maybe for payment. What was the situation before the M-Pesa came? And to be complete, we must capture again a group that did not use M-Pesa and see whether these two groups are different, the performance different. And then we can say, yes, M-Pesa brought this impact. There is a term called attribution. Attribution is, in simple terms, is the action of regarding something as being caused by an intervention. The question to ask is, how do we know the observed impact, influence, effect is attributed to this change? How can we know that the performance that we're measuring due to the impact of M-Pesa can only be attributed to M-Pesa? Now, this is what necessitates the question, how will the situation have been in the absence of the intervention? Or will the observed impact, influence, effect have been the same if there was no intervention? I know you are now following it. You are now seeing the counter thing. You are also seeing a comparison group. You are also seeing a control group. That for us to attribute the change you are measuring, we must do exactly that, measuring what would have happened if there was no intervention, and for that matter, taking a group that the intervention didn't affect. So, there is also a word called spillover. You see, sometimes, even if you use a control or comparison group, they can be affected by intervention. In other words, it might be difficult to completely stop effects of an intervention from reaching the control group. We must consider that, even as we do our impact, effect, influence, the spillover. If you're going to have a control group. Now, influence of innovation on the financial performance of small and medium women enterprises in the city. This again was a recent study in Cohort. Now, we were looking at the influence of innovation on financial performance on SMEs. But now, assuming that the study focused on women enterprises that were trained in innovations, there could be a possibility that those not trained, the control group, observed those trained and gained even without having been trained. So we're going to look at people trained in financial or in innovations, and we're using a control group of those who are not trained. But if these people were mixing, the likelihood that those who are not trained remotely gained, and that therefore their results and influence exists. That possibility exists. Therefore, as you go on doing your impact, make sure you have that taken care of. Then there is something called contamination. Contamination. This occurs when members of a treatment or combustion groups have access to other interventions which also affect the outcome of interest. Look, the impact of 844 education system on the development of an enterprise culture for business establishment and growth. Again, this was a recent study in cohort. But what are we saying? During the period of 844, there were also other interventions that could have affected the enterprise culture. There was Women Enterprise Fund. There was WESO Fund. There was Youth Enterprise Fund. These interventions, which were also going on at the same time as the 844, impacted the enterprise culture. So we're saying contamination. The group that is being studied may have been contaminated with the other interventions. So we have to take care of that. Now let's talk about methodology. I'm afraid this is the most, maybe I say the elephant in the room for people taking on impact, influence, and effect studies. We have said impact evaluation designs are identified by the type of methods used to generate the counterfactual. The counterfactual is very important and can be broadly classified in 3 categories. Experimental, so it's experimental design. Impact, quasi-experimental, or non-experimental designs. So when we start saying descriptive design, survey design, yes, but for impact, experimental, quasi-experimental, and non-experimental are the key. So without using those, then your results, your research, well, you see, are you reading my board language? Yes. So to make it concrete, to make it undisputable, those methods are key. Now, many of the studies I have looked at in cohort on impact, effect, and influence did not effectively imply those methods or those methodologies. But then what is experimental? What's experimental design? This design entails when you now want to study the impact, you must get a baseline study, baseline information. Remember, you are going to move from point A to point B. You are going to measure an outcome. You are going to measure change. That change must be moving from a previous point to the next point. And that is why baseline data information is important. It's like we're going to evaluate. And when you evaluate, you look at where we were and where we are now. And therefore, baseline information is very important. That means you can get a large group that has similar aspects and then divide it into two and apply an intervention on one and hold the other one in that intervention, and after some time, measure the difference. So if it's training, for example, of women in innovation, get an entire group that is same, no training. They are performing similar, they are in similar situations, similar conditions, and then divide them into two, and then go and train one, leave the other one, ensuring the contamination that we talked about, the spillover that we talked about. So one becomes a control group, the counterfactual, a combatant group. And then after the training, wait for some time and see the performance, because impact is not immediate. Effect may not be immediate. So wait for some time and now go measure using the information from the data line, the baseline survey. If it was performance, what was the performance? What has changed? That is experimental. Now, when you do, I said, two groups, the treatment and the control, and then you randomly select the treatment group, randomization. If you do that, it's pure experimental. But if you don't use randomization, then it is quasi-experimental. When the selection of the treatment group is not random, the method becomes quasi. Random means chosen by chance, that every element has the same probability of being chosen. So this is what we're saying. We have the groups here, 6, and then you split them into two. One is a control group, the group that does not receive intervention. The other one is the treatment group that receives intervention, and then measure these two groups after a while, and then see whether there is a difference in them, and then conclude, therefore, there's an impact or not. Because indeed, sometimes intervention may have no impact. Can have even negative impacts. Non-experimental designs. In non-experimental designs, the groups already exist. You are not going to choose and then treat them. You already exist, and the researcher cannot and does not attempt to manipulate an independent variable. The research is simply comparing existing groups. In other words, it may not be you to go to choose the group, then divide them and do an experiment on them. These groups may already exist. But now, that will be non-experimental, because it's no longer experiment you're going to measure. And I want to say, most of our studies that I've seen in cohort have taken this approach. You go out there, the women already existed, the intervention already existed, and you start looking, studying it. Yes, you're going to bring out something, but you can see. You don't know all those contaminations. You don't know all those, spillovers. And therefore, your results should have a rider. You should say, we did it in an non-experimental, and therefore, there are some facts that we didn't get access to. And therefore, you can see that those results are weaker than a pure experimental. So, what are we saying therefore? For us to effectively do impact study, we must at the end measure what we call diff in diff, a difference in a difference. Remember, we said we're doing a pure experimental design. You get a group, divide it into two. That group, that baseline information, they were similar at this point A. They were similar. Performance similar, profitability, all those parameters that you want to measure were similar. And then apply an intervention on one after you have divided them into two randomly so. And then both of them, after some time, both of them will be different. After 1 year, both of them will be different from the year one and the year you are measuring. So that's already difference. But again, at the end of the year measurement, one, like the treatment group, may again be different from. So that's why we are calling difference in a difference. Let us illustrate this. The D in a D. At this stage, the yellow is the control group. The black is the treatment group. At this stage, baseline data, you took them at this stage, time 0. All were the same. Then you took the control and the treatment and started observing them after the intervention. T1, T2, T3. You can see that both of them are increasing, but of course the treatment group may be increasing, maybe faster, maybe slower, or maybe similarly. So the difference from T0 to T3 will be different, both of them. But then the impact will be that now last difference between the treatment and the control. And this is when you will claim you have done an impact study. This was an overview. And I'm saying, I hope I have had an impact on your preparation for research. Well, did you say I have had an effect? Or did you say I have influenced you? Whichever way I have done, thank you for listening to me. And have an effective and impactfully influential day. Want you. In summary, doing an impact, an effect, and an influence study is tricky. It is doable. It is involving. Methodologies that we use on them are specific, special. So beware of that as we choose those titles in your studies. Now, if you enjoyed it, please like it, share it. Let's share this knowledge. Also subscribe for being notified on my other postings. But maybe you wish to support us as we bring you more. If you really want to support us, you can donate. You can reach us on that website. There is directions for donation. Or you can just use this Lipa na M-Pesa buy goods number 5476465. But most importantly, consider these methodologies, this overview, as you go on to do your impact. Because after all, you will publish those results, but people looking at it will doubt. People looking at your work will be like, is this an impact? And therefore, you can easily injure your profession by doing a half-hearted impact, effect, influence study. Thank you very much.